A carpet cleaner hands a team of auditors a confidentiality agreement before letting them inspect his biggest job. They sign it. They walk the building and approve every number. The building isn't his. So how does a 21-year-old carpet cleaner take Wall Street for $300 million? Nobody audits a miracle. Barry Minkow is 9 years old when he starts answering phones at the carpet cleaning company where his mother works as a telephone solicitor. He listens to her sell two-room cleanings to strangers, and he learns the exact sentence that turns a hang-up into an appointment. At 16, he moves 4 second-hand cleaning machines into his parents' garage in Reseda, prints business cards, and calls it ZZ Best. He cannot drive to his own jobs, so his friends drive him, and he does the selling from the passenger seat. He is a small, fast-talking teenager in a company polo shirt, and customers trust him immediately because nobody expects a child to lie about carpet. He works the phones until midnight, sleeps a few hours, then rides to school with invoices folded in his backpack. His classmates spend their weekends at the mall, and he spends his dragging steam machines up apartment staircases in the valley heat. He is not pretending to be an entrepreneur. He is genuinely better at selling carpet cleaning than the adults who taught him. By his senior year of high school, he has a crew, a route, and a company that grosses real money every single week. He wins a local business award and gives a speech about hustle to a room full of men 3 times his age. He also has a problem that has nothing to do with carpet. A minor cannot sign a binding contract, cannot hold a business line of credit, and cannot walk into a bank and borrow against next month's invoices. Carpet cleaning eats cash before it pays. Machines break, chemicals run out, and crews expect wages on Friday, whether the customers have paid or not. A single burnt-out motor can cost more than a week of jobs, and there is no line of credit anywhere that will cover it for him. So Minkow writes a check from one account to cover a shortfall in another, then covers that check with a third, riding the days it takes a bank to clear paper. He stages break-ins at his own offices and files insurance claims on equipment that was never stolen. He runs charges through customer credit card numbers for cleanings that never happened, small enough that most people never scan their statements. Every one of these is a crime, and every one of them buys him another week of payroll. None of it feels like theft to him, because in his mind, every dollar is borrowed against a company that will eventually be big enough to repay it. This is the sentence he will repeat for the rest of his life. He was never stealing. He was only meeting payroll. The distinction matters to nobody except him, and it is the reason he never stops. And each week he survives teaches him the lesson that will destroy him. A number on paper is worth exactly as much as the person willing to confirm it. Minkow needs someone who can confirm anything, and he finds him in an insurance claims adjuster named Tom Paget. Paget has spent his career approving damage restoration work, the enormous jobs that follow a fire or a flood, where insurers pay contractors to rebuild whole floors of a building. Together, they create a company called Interstate Appraisal Services, and it exists almost entirely as an address, a letterhead, and a telephone. When a bank calls Interstate to verify that ZZZ Best is restoring a damaged building for $3 million, Paget answers and confirms it. The call takes 90 seconds. It is the only verification anyone performs, and it is the entire foundation of everything that follows. On paper, ZZZ's Best is no longer a teenager's carpet route. It is a restoration contractor with contracts too large for a bank to ignore. A financial consultant named Mark Moores joins them and begins manufacturing the paperwork underneath the story. Invoices, contracts, and job records, eventually tens of thousands of pages of them. Bankers who would never lend $100,000 to a carpet cleaner will lend $1 million to a restoration contractor with signed insurance contracts. The paperwork does not describe a lie about carpet cleaning. It describes an entirely different company, one that happens to share the same name and the same young owner. Minkow keeps the real business running the whole time, because the genuine crews and genuine customers are what make the invented half look ordinary. Nobody at any bank ever drives to a restoration site. Going public is designed to be the hardest thing a company ever does, because the moment a stock trades, strangers' retirement money is inside it. An independent accounting firm has to examine the books, confirm that the revenue is real, and sign its own name to that conclusion. Underwriters put their reputation behind the offering, and lawyers file documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission, where a false line is a federal crime. Analysts read the filings, banks extend credit against the audited numbers, and every layer is supposed to catch what the layer beneath it missed. This is the most heavily inspected doorway in American business, and it was built specifically to stop people like Barry Minkow. ZZZZZ. Best walks through all of it, and in early 1986, the stock begins trading on NASDAQ. Because the machine had one flaw, nobody had thought to close. Every layer verified the paperwork, and not one of them was required to stand in the building. Auditors confirm that a contract exists, that an invoice matches it, and that a payment arrived, and all three of those things are true. The buildings are the only part of the story that cannot be forged, and the buildings are the one part nobody inspects. So the fraud does not defeat the system. It simply walks through the single door the system left open. The auditors from Ernst & Winnie finally ask to see one, and they choose the largest restoration job on the books, a $7 million rebuild in Sacramento. Morze flies up first, drives the city looking for a building large enough to be worth $7 million, and finds one still under construction. He tells the property manager he represents a company scouting the space for a tenant, hands over a deposit, and gets the keys for the weekend. Then he dresses the building. Z. Best signs on the doors, drop cloths on the floors, cleaning equipment in the corridors, a crew inside looking busy. He spends a weekend and a few $1,000s turning an empty shell into the most valuable job in the company's history. Before the auditors arrive, Minkow's people ask them to sign a confidentiality agreement. The restoration client, they explain, insists that nobody discuss the job. The auditors sign, tour the floors, note that the work looks complete and professional, and approve the $7 million. The agreement they signed prevents them from ever calling the building's actual owner to ask a single question. On the drive back, they are impressed enough to note that Best runs a clean, well-managed job site. Moores returns the keys on Monday, takes down the signs, and the $7 million restoration ceases to exist. That single approved job is what allows the company to be valued in the hundreds of millions. Nobody audits a miracle. By 1987, the stock reaches $18 a share, and ZZ Best is valued at roughly $280 million. Minkow's own stake is worth around $100 million, and he is not yet legally old enough to have finished a 4-year degree. The company employs about 1,000 people across offices in California, Nevada, and Arizona, and the carpet cleaning is entirely genuine. Roughly 86% of the revenue is not. It is restoration work on buildings that were never damaged, for insurers that never existed. He buys a red Ferrari with a personalized plate, a house with a ZZZ Best crest at the bottom of the pool, and a wardrobe built for television. He sits across from Oprah Winfrey as the youngest chief executive of a public company in America and tells teenagers to believe in themselves. He writes a book about his rise while the restoration division that generates most of his revenue does not physically exist. Financial magazines write him up as proof the system still rewards a kid who works harder than everybody else. He hires a public relations team, and the story they sell is irresistible. The American dream still works, and here is a boy in a Ferrari to prove it. Every institution that touches him has a reason to want him to be real. The Underwriters, the Analysts, the banks, and the reporters who made him famous. And every month the fraud has to grow, because the only thing paying last month's lie is this month's bigger one. A Ponzi structure has one absolute requirement. The money coming in must always exceed the money going out, forever, without a single slow month. To bridge the gaps before the public offering, Minkow borrows from Jack Catane, a Los Angeles figure with organized crime associations, at rates that consume the loan. He is 19 years old, sleeping a few hours a night, and running a company where he personally knows which numbers are false. He starts using drugs to hold the schedule together, and the people around him begin to notice a chief executive who cannot sit still. He installs a private bathroom beside his office so that nobody watches him come and go during the working day. Moores is producing paperwork faster than any real company could generate it, and the volume itself becomes a risk nobody can hide. Minkow tries to buy a legitimate national carpet chain because a real acquisition with real revenue could finally make the fake numbers true. The plan requires $40 million he does not have, and the collapse arrives before the rescue does. Insurance restoration on the scale. Best claims does not exist anywhere in the country, and a single curious analyst with a calculator could have proven it. By the spring of 1987, the company needs several $1 million a month in fresh money, simply to stay upright. Minkow is now the most visible young executive in America and the most trapped man in the building. A woman in Los Angeles goes through her credit card statement and finds charges from a carpet cleaning company for work she never ordered. She keeps the paperwork, and when she cannot get an explanation, she takes it to a reporter at the Los Angeles Times. The story that runs in the spring of 1987 is not about securities fraud. It is about a few $100s in overcharges. The stock falls 28%, and the questions that follow are the ones no layer of the machine ever asked. Which buildings and where? The restoration contracts collapse in a matter of days because a lie that survived 3 years of audits cannot survive one reporter with an address list. Within weeks, ZZZ Best is in bankruptcy, and the auction of everything the company owns raises about $64,000. Minkow is indicted on 57 counts, including racketeering, securities fraud, bank fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, and tax evasion. At 23, he is sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $26 million in restitution. Paget and Moores are convicted too, and the accounting profession rewrites how auditors are required to verify a client's largest jobs. ZZZZ. Best becomes a required case study in accounting programs, taught not as a story about a criminal, but as a story about a procedure. The lesson every student is given is short. Confirm the existence of the asset, not the existence of the paperwork describing it. Investors and lenders lose roughly $100 million, and most of them never see any of it again. He serves roughly 7.5 years, and he leaves prison as an ordained minister. He becomes the pastor of a church in San Diego, founds the Fraud Discovery Institute, and starts exposing other people's frauds for a living. He trains FBI agents and federal prosecutors on how financial deception actually works, because no one alive can explain it better from the inside. For more than a decade, he is treated as the profession's great redemption story, invited to speak at universities and quoted in newspapers as an authority on honesty. In 2011, he pleads guilty to manipulating the stock of the home builder Lennar, having quietly bet against the companies he was publicly accusing. In 2014, he pleads guilty again, this time to stealing roughly $3 million from the congregation that had trusted him. His restitution obligations now total more than $600 million, an amount no working lifetime can repay. Every institution that was supposed to stop him examined his paperwork, and the paperwork was always perfect. Nobody audits a miracle. If you want the fraud that finally forced Wall Street to change the rules, watch the insider trading case in the description. Subscribe to Fiscal Folders, because there is always another set of books.